10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. All three engines up and burning. 2, 1, 0, and liftoff. The final liftoff of Atlantis on the shoulders of the space shuttle.
Hello and welcome to this episode of My Model Corner. For this video chapter, we place the spotlight on the T-38 Talon in NASA livery. While I don't expect this to be a very challenging model technically, it will be a chance to demonstrate a couple of modeling techniques I utilize in particular circumstances. It's always good to practice certain skills to keep them sharp in our hobby toolbox. To beef up this presentation, I'll also recount a little about my meetings with a couple of different NASA astronauts, including one who later perished on the Space Shuttle Challenger. The T-38 continues to be the workhorse for the U.S. manned space program. It has been used extensively for training, as a chase plane, and ferried the astronauts to meetings with contractors and to NASA facilities. Thus the T-38 is identifiable as a NASA icon as much as the Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, Skylab, Space Shuttle, and International Space Station vehicles. We have the cockpit decal sheet and an exterior emblem decal sheet. There is the NASA black and yellow banner that graced the tails of NASA aircraft from 1959 through 1975 and is only applicable to the T-38A model. Missing is the NASA logo type, also known as the NASA worm design, that ran from 1975 to 1992. To me, it's highly recognizable with the Space Shuttle program during the height of my interest in the space program. Therefore, I will turn to my technique of making custom decals of the logo as well as the tail number 924, which you saw at the beginning of this video. In 1992, it was decided to revert to the Motorelli design affectionately known as the NASA meatball. The space program's transition was slow, so there is overlap of retired symbols. In fact, the shuttles Columbia, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour still flashed the NASA worm until 1998. After an avionics upgrade to the T-38s, NASA aircraft managers were faced with having to repaint a fleet of more than 25 tails of their Talons with the meatball. A simplified version of the meatball insignia known as the NASA swoosh was applied to the T-38s, yet it was and remains an unofficial logo. It was never approved by NASA headquarters. NASA T-38 Tail 924 was one I came upon unexpectedly at an air show, and I got to meet astronaut Charles Gamar. He hadn't been assigned to a shuttle mission yet, but he gave me the shuttle patch you can see in the middle. I wrote him afterwards and he autographed the photo and enclosed an additional note as well as the MFA decal seen here. He later flew STS-38 Atlantis, STS-48 Discovery, and finally STS-62 Columbia during his career. Now, let's begin with the construction of the cockpit. The T-38A forward cockpit instrumentation has changed since my picture from 1989. Upgrades and advances in avionics appear in the model parts with nice detail and match the modernized T-38C cockpit image. Here's the reason why I don't build 72 or 144 scale aircraft. This has got to be the smallest piece I've ever tried to install on a 1/48 scale model. Of course, shortly after this shot, the piece flew off like a rocket out of my tweezers, never to be found. I'm convinced that all these tiny missing pieces from my projects are gathered together somewhere, giggling at me. For the cockpit, the pieces have fit very nicely together. Before we finish construction, we'll need to put a coat of paint on and do some detailing. For the cockpit panels and instrumentation, Trumpeter provides a mix of raised molded detail and decals. You're compelled to use this combination or sand down the molding and make it an all-decal interior display. I'll go the mixed route while also using some decals on the formed panels where detailed dials and LCD screen imagery can be added. For the front seat rails, we scrape away some of the paint to simulate wear and to provide some detail.
Godspeed, John Glenn.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around.
Germany 4, Hawaii, Capcom. We just had word from Houston. We're ready to have you get out whenever you're ready.
What I'd like to do is get all the way out here and get a picture with the whole spacecraft. I don't see us doing that. Yeah, I noticed that. You can't get far enough away.
No.
The flight director says get back in.
Jim, got any message for us?
Jimmy 4, get back in.
It was all over in one stunned, horrifying second. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, the prime crew of Apollo 1, are in a simulated countdown for the flight at Cape Kennedy. Horrified engineers watched the burst of flames and smoke envelop.
And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
I'll add some panel wash here in the back to add some detail on the lighter gray color.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
This is Houston. Say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a main B bus undervolt. Roger, main B undervolt. Okay, stand by, 13. We're looking at it.
I was strolling on the moon one day in a merry month of December. May. Probably one of the most significant things we can think about when we think about Apollo is that it has opened for us being the world, a challenge of the future. In order to remind all the peoples of the world in so many countries throughout the world that this is what we all are striving for in the future. America's challenge of today has forged man's destiny of tomorrow. And as we leave the moon in Taurus Littrow, we leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return with peace and hope for all mankind. Godspeed the crew of Apollo 17.
After airbrushing the panel base color, we painstakingly paint the frames of the dials, screens, and panels with a fine-tipped hand brush. Also using the brush, we paint the upfront control buttons. Using a knife and a needle tip, we can add colors to some of the buttons and switches. I purposely distribute the paint unevenly on the panels and buttons to replicate a worn look. Finally, we add decals to the faces of the console instruments. In the end, a number of different methods were exploited to bring out all the details. I planned to build this kit in the older exterior style of my NASA Tail 924, a T-38A class jet at the time of my viewing. You may ask, why didn't you get the T-38A set? They're still available in the US Air Force version, and you just need to change the decals and paint job. That's a good question. Prior to the purchase of the model, I didn't realize the differences were all that great, and having seen the NASA box art, I just immediately went for it. Our brass set consists mainly of seatbelts and shoulder harnesses. There are some cockpit mirrors and the base for the HUD glass. As is my convention, I use a sheet of portrait glass to cut and manipulate photo etch pieces. The trick is to bend and curve these metal parts into something that resembles cloth belts and look nonchalantly placed in the seats. I recommend using cyanoacrylate glue to secure pieces like these.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. We've gone for main engine start. We have main engine start. 0, 0. And we have liftoff. Liftoff of America's first space shuttle. And the shuttle has cleared the tower. 14 seconds. Houston now controlling. Their mission control confirms roll maneuver started. Roll program complete. Roger, roll complete. 25 seconds, roll maneuver completed. 30 seconds, 1 nautical mile in altitude now for Columbia.
We now attach the nose gear and then the main gear bays. Up to this point, the parts install nicely. Some fit exactly and are snug and almost don't require glue. There is a little misalignment between the fuselage halves. The top seam line is even while the lower fuselage will require some putty and sanding efforts. So we come to our first couple of tools that we need to retrieve from our chest of modeling know-how, making modifications to an existing kit and scratch building parts. To make our fuselage retro conversion, mainly we'll need to add the peppermint pitot static tube, add this lower antenna, modify the leading edge of the air intakes, and simplify the look of the engine nozzles. Let's start the changeover process with the engine nozzles as it's the easiest. All we have to do is cut and smooth away these nozzle ejector actuation system lines.
So, you ever been to Disneyland?
Affirmative.
That was definitely an e-ticket.
Roger that, Sally.
I'm going to go on a tangent with my experience meeting another astronaut and the loss of the Space Shuttle Challenger. It's a little lengthy, so if you're not interested in this part, I've added a timestamp on the screen so you can skip over it and back to model building. In November 1984, I had a chance to attend a small lecture given by astronaut Dick Scobie that included video and a slideshow of his previous shuttle mission, Challenger 41 Charlie. I was quite excited as this mission had been covered live on television and it was the most ambitious to date. They launched the LDEF and performed the exciting rescue mission of the malfunctioning Solar Max satellite, plucking it from orbit. It was an amazing sight to see coming from space. After the lecture, Scobie met with a few of us who just couldn't get enough. He looked at me, smiled, and said, "What can I do for you?" I replied, "Just your autograph, sir," and I handed him this postcard. He quickly looked it over to make sure he wasn't signing his house over to me or something, and wrote down his name. I found out later this is how he signed most items. He merely printed out his name. While speaking with us, his wife June mentioned to us that she was on the committee to select a teacher in space who we would later come to know as Krista McAuliffe from New Hampshire. I went home and filed away my autograph from Scobie and my wonderful experience of his talk, little knowing that in just over a year disaster would strike the shuttle program horribly. January 28, 1986 became the first date of my generation with one of those events that you remember where you were and what you were doing when you hear catastrophic news. The mission had been scrubbed previously due to a hatch problem, and I hadn't expected a launch that tragic Tuesday. The mainstream TV media wasn't going to be covering it anyway. Too boring. I came back from a breakfast that morning and happened to turn on the radio. I heard that there must be a tug in the heart for Krista McAuliffe. I assumed they meant people were happy that she finally reached orbit, and I was surprised that they launched. But then I heard the media saw parachutes and they reported that paramedics were jumping into the ocean looking for survivors. However, it turned out the reporters got it wrong as usual when it came to the space program. It was actually one parachute of one of the solid rocket booster nose cones. I immediately turned on the television and saw the replay of the launch of Challenger 51L. Everything looked normal to my shuttle enthusiast's eye with the start of the blastoff, even to NASA. Then astronaut Dick Covey, acting as Capcom, radioed to the shuttle that all looked normal, indicated with the customary call, "Challenger, go at throttle up." The final audio transmission from Challenger came with Dick Scobie's reply.
Roger, go at throttle up.
In an instant, the entire shuttle stack flew apart from aerodynamic forces within the fireball of escaped fuel. All 7 on board died when the cockpit hit the ocean. It was horrific and the most historically tragic thing I had ever seen, involving someone I had met.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink.
A few years later, memorabilia that Scobie was carrying on the Challenger mission for his alma mater, the University of Arizona, were donated to the college after their recovery from the wreckage. It included a banner that commemorated the centennial anniversary of the university. Whether by design or accident, you could reach under the bottomless display case and touch that U of A banner. While this story is sad, I wanted to keep my recollections alive a little while longer. I had dreamt of flying in space one day, and I met a man who achieved and was living that very dream when he died. The pitot tube for the T-38 is about 3 feet long, which makes it 7/8 of an inch long in 48 scale. I searched through boxes of old model parts looking for something that I could recycle for use or modify. I found this shovel from the Flak Panzer kit. Just cutting away the spade and cleaning up the handle, I came up with my scratch part. Drilling a hole and creating a groove in the nose, we can now add our tube to the jet when ready. For the intakes, we cut and angle the fairing of the leading edge and adjust the shape of the kit-supplied intake lips as well as the flange. I thought this alteration was going to be difficult, but it worked out rather well. I used sandpaper and a sanding stick to smooth out the edge before applying the leading edge lips. Next, I add a little putty to complete a smoother makeover. We're ready to add the main coat of paint to our T-38. NASA keeps their jets very clean and shiny, so we are unable to use black shading, pre-shading, or any significant weathering to detail our Talon. I found doing an even glossy coat of the white difficult. There always seemed to be areas where the plastic color was showing through. I had to be careful not to create thin and thick areas of paint on the flight control surfaces.
Return to space as Discovery clears the tower.
Roger roll, Discovery. Crew confirms roll program. Houston now controlling. Discovery, go at throttle up. Roger go. Discovery given a go at throttle up. 3 engines at 104%.
That to ascend through this seemingly tranquil sea will always be fraught with danger. Let us remember the Challenger crew, whose voyage was so tragically short. Today, up here where the blue sky turns to black, we can say at long last to Dick, Mike, Judy, to Ron and Elle, and to Krista and Greg. Dear friends, we have resumed the journey that we promised to continue for you. Dear friends, your loss has meant that we could confidently begin anew. Dear friends, your spirit and your dream are still alive in our hearts.
Discovery's 4 computers now have primary control of critical vehicle functions.
Discovery, nominal MECO, ohms 1 not required.
For our next scratch item, we fashion a lower antenna, which is easy enough. We have plenty of these tabs on the sprues that are just right. We just have to sand off the number and make a small angled cut on its leading edge. For our final add-on, we create a static discharger for the tail by cutting off a bristle from this steel brush. Then we use a small drill bit to provide a channel for the discharger. We want to keep the landing gear clean, but provide shadows by using the panel wash. Then we can throw on the tires. For my final personal story, I'll talk about the shuttle Columbia. Please follow the timestamp if you want to jump back to T-38 model building. On an exciting morning in February, I was getting ready to realize my dream of flying on an F-16 fighter jet from my airbase. The day had arrived after waiting 11 years.
In Columbia, Houston, we see your tire pressure messages, and we did not copy your last.
Instrumentation, Max?
Flight Max, but also off. Houston, UHF com check. Columbia, Houston, UHF com check.
But news shortly broke that my favorite space shuttle, Columbia, had disintegrated during re-entry, killing all 7 astronauts. It had happened again. This time, a piece of foam from the external tank broke away during launch and hit the leading edge of Columbia's left wing, creating a hole that would make it susceptible to extreme heat and the high stresses of re-entry. NASA had suspected something was wrong after reviewing launch recordings, but they did not pursue it fully while the mission was still in progress. Although there may have been nothing to do to rescue the doomed shuttle, NASA had become complacent again and placed another strike on the program's sustainability. Life went on, but the shuttle program did not. It would fade out. America's manned space effort only continues now at a crawl, hitching rides on Russian rockets to the ISS.
Mission complete, Houston. After serving the world for over 30 years, the space shuttle's earned its place in history and it's come to a final stop.
We want to continue by adding black striping to the leading edges of the flight control surfaces as well as the pinstripe patterns on the top of the main wings. We mask these areas to create crisp lines. The cockpit canopy sections have a light seam that needs to be buffed out using a very fine grit sanding stick. This wasn't too bad, and I didn't need to break out the rubbing compound. Next comes the airbrush prep for the glass frames. I prefer the even coat the airbrush affords rather than hand brushing in the color. We've reached the point to paint the main fuselage with the gloss white. This pigment seems to dry slowly, and it required more than one session to apply the white to avoid fingerprint and other handling impressions. Again, it was work to achieve an even coat. The decals we need to custom create are the NASA worm logo, tail number 924, and the numerals for the left speed brake, which are the last two digits of the tail number. The kit decals provide for the 564 and 821 registration alphanumerics. We can cut, flip the 6 into a 9, and then splice these labels to produce the November 924 November Alpha identifier. NASA uses the Helvetica Heavy font for tail numbers, which is very similar to the Arial font available in Word document programs and works for the characters we need in this case. I create a draft sheet with extra copies of each of the labels in case there is a problem in the application to the model. I directly measured two lengths off these vertical tail lines directly from the computer screen and then compared to the model's lengths and arrived at a ratio. Any measured insignia off the screen could be multiplied by this fraction to arrive at the decal sizes needed for the model. Once properly scaled, I print out a test page on regular paper to ensure the size, color, and any unforeseen problems are evaluated before printing to the blank decal paper. I apply a quick sprayed layer of gloss coat to help fix the ink to the decal page. Don't soak the sheet as you might inadvertently activate the decals. Once the initial coat has dried, apply 1 or 2 more protective coats of the gloss. Once that has dried, we'll be ready to cut, soak, and apply our emblems. Since NASA keeps their T-38s almost hot rod clean, we should apply our detailing in a minimal fashion. This gloss coat has been a bear for me to apply, and I don't want the potential to ruin it, so I go with my pencil shading technique to highlight panel lines and screws. I add pencil lines, then clean up and adjust with an eraser. In this shot, I remove masking that helped craft the peppermint stick pattern on the pitot static tube. I then applied the photo etch rear view mirrors on the cockpit mid-frame. Insanely small detail. Yet this kit does not provide the navigation lenses for the vertical tail. After applying my wash to the tail surfaces, I fabricate those missing glass pieces out of transparency sprue tabs. Once cut down and sanded to size, I affix them to the tail. Here's a clip during painting of the trim of the leading edge to the air intakes. Also, airbrushing to the top of the nose and radome using the same color. After attaching the engine nozzles, we apply some more paint. This is followed on by pencil shading the main fuselage. We can start applying our decals. I start with our uniquely made emblems. I perform the usual practice of application, removal of moisture and air using the swab, and then applying microsol. I haven't used Tamiya's Mark Fit, so I don't know how these custom decals would react to that fixture. It's something I'll have to try in the future. And we use the identical procedure for the speed brake. Now that the left side of the vertical tail is dry, we do the right side. Now for the worrisome part, adding these long pinstripe patterns along the fuselage. We have to keep them straight, properly aligned, and all without breaking or warping the decal. I apply the decal and slowly remove moisture in a gentle fashion to prevent moving the pattern until it can set in a little more, and then we can more aggressively affix the label. Once we are confident everything is in place, we apply the microsol. Next, I methodically cut and splice together the registration numbers to get our specific identifier. Okay, we're getting to the end here and have arrived to one of the last steps of construction, the attachment of the landing gear and doors. To add a little more flair, I add remove before flight flags on the pitot tube and main gear safety pins. It's time to put this jet out on the flight line. Take care, and we'll see you later.